A lot of people probably would skip over effects when talking about subtractive synthesis because it's not a part of the method at all, really, right? Our oscillator into our filter, into our amplifier. There's nothing about reverb, nothing about delay, nothing about chorus. But I think in 2016, 2017, especially with the more modern instruments you're buying, even instruments going back to, the mid 2000s, they're coming bundled with a lot of effects. So it is important that you as the user know how to locate those effects, how to turn them on and off, and to get a feel for the sound, because you don't have to necessarily use the effects that come bundled with the instrument, but they're there for a reason. They're there for you to use when appropriate. Now, remember, you can always use additional effects outside of the instrument, third-party plugins, whatever, and you might prefer the way those sounds. But I often find developers try to tailor make the effects to work well with their instrument. It's a good selling point. Most of the presets you pull up are chocked full of effects to try to make the instrument sound even larger than life. And that's totally fine, especially once you understand the method and you know how to turn them off and how to kind of pick and choose your spots. So that's really kind of the important part of this video, what I just said. But we'll go through a few examples and talk about how effects can radically kind of change sounds and maybe when it's appropriate, when it isn't appropriate. All right, so we have the Tall Noisemaker loaded up. This is a free instrument right now. No effects have been added. And interestingly, we're not getting any level from oscillator 1 or oscillator 2, and that's because here in this oscillator crush, we have this turned all the way down. We need to bring that up if we want to be able to get our other oscillators, which is just kind of a weird effect, but it's something we have to do. All right, so let's go ahead and detune these slightly. Make more of a super saw. If we want to be able to play chords, we'll just take our voices, bring those up to 6. And right away with this control tab open, I have some master effects. And these are things that are definitely worth experimenting with. We have a little bit of vintage noise we can bring into the signal, which will help thicken it up even further. And then we have a detune on voices. So if this was on mono, this would make no impact. But when we play like a chord, okay, I just want you to listen closely. Hear a little bit of that, and I like a little bit of that effect. We also have a master high pass. We'll come back to the filter drive in a second. So let's go and open up our ADSR and also our filter here. Let's just add a little bit of like release. Let's do more of maybe a pluck sound. All right, I'm happy with that. Let's use this filter. We can see we have a few different options. And again, like I've said before, low pass really taking precedence here. Let's go with the low pass 18. And this is just setting the depth here going into the filter envelope. So let's set up something similar. Maybe we'll try a couple of the other filters. Yeah. Too much. Actually, maybe we'll try this one. All right, so I'm pretty happy with this sound right now, but let's beef it up by using some of these effects. Let's try out this filter drive. Adds a little saturation in there. Let's add in a chorus. We can try both. And that completely changes around the sound. We obviously have a reverb we can use. Let's throw some like long pre-delay on this. This will be interesting. Let's kind of like use a bandpass here. And we could also add a delay, but I think because of that long pre-delay, I probably wouldn't. But just as an FYI, we could throw a little bit of delay on here. Let's put the feedback down, and let's change this delay time to something very quick. Yeah, I definitely would not use delay on this sort of a sound, but just as an FYI, it's in there, and this is about kind of picking and choosing your spots. So now that we have all of these effects put into place, I would probably go back into the instrument and maybe fine-tune these settings here in the envelope. So for listening back. And there you have it, how effects can completely alter a sound. And this, again, you know, without the effects, this wouldn't be the same sort of preset. It probably wouldn't have the same kind of appeal. Now, with a sound with this much reverb, this much processing on it, it's going to take up a lot of space in your mix, but that's kind of part of finding this balance and using effects and knowing when you're just trying to make a really cool preset and then when you're also trying to actually use something in a track. So those are just things I want you to keep in the back of your head. I know I'm talking a lot in this video, but I think that's important when it comes to adding on effects to your subtractive synthesizers. It's really picking your spots and knowing what you're trying to accomplish. So here would be an example of an analog modeled software synthesizer, Tal's version of the Juno. And with this instrument, part of what makes this sound its sound is the chorus. And you had two different modes that you could turn on or off, or you could even have both of them in combination. And so when we load up a preset like Warm Pad, it sounds really nice. It sounds warm. It sounds very analog-y, very like 80s, right? But when we go and we add in the chorus and we kind of find a balance of what we like, it takes us in a totally different direction. So or we can try the other model. Put them both in together. And so again, this is an example where the effect module that's built into the instrument is just as important, I would argue, as any other section here that we see. And in this example, I'd probably just prefer to have this chorus 1 version set up. That seems to sound the best with this pad. But I just want to show you how, yes, even in some analog instruments, there were effects built in, and those effects could contribute greatly to the sound. In the case of an instrument like Botzilla, which, you know, apart from using a modular type signal flow, is oftentimes routed and set up in a subtractive manner, you go in and you look at the effects and you see things like a spring reverb and a distortion with a lot of kind of old school styles to pick and choose from. And you start to say to yourself, oh, okay, this makes sense. Like a spring reverb would probably pair well with something like a modular synthesizer. It kind of fits in that same sort of experimental, grungy sort of vibe. And so a lot of times, like I was saying, developers really do think about those things and try to put in effects that might match well for the instrument. So in the case of this preset, we already have a distortion and delay brought in. So let's just take a listen real quick. So let's listen to it without the distortion, without the delay. And so for me, I'm liking the way this distortion sounds, but I don't necessarily think I need the delay. So I bring back in the distortion, which is also adding some gain. Maybe I'll drive it in even harder. Really get something low and grungy if I needed that. Or we can kind of make it more hi-fi. Kind of like that. And we could try what it sounds like throwing in, a phaser. It may not work in this case. That's kind of cool. Maybe just a touch of that. Gives us some movement that we could try experimenting with this spring reverb. And something else that we see in this instrument is that we can change the signal flow. So maybe I want the distortion coming after the phaser. No, I liked it the other way before. Let's bring on a little bit of this spring reverb here. Something like this is kind of cool. Let's try tension the other side. I like it in the middle. So this is completely changed around this sound, and yeah, we would have to do a lot in mixing to kind of make this work, but I kind of like this. So now maybe I could experiment at different octaves. In which case I'd probably go back in and again experiment with some of these different effects parameters. But what I'm trying to show you is that even just using the effects, you can completely change around presets and get them to fit in maybe different contexts or, just come up with something brand new. Occasionally you come across instruments with specialty effects that you really just can't find anywhere else, not even in the third-party plugin development world. And Absynth is a good example of that. So if we go into our effects section here, we have just a basic sine wave. I turn on the effects. I'm only allowed to use one of these. And the one that I think I associate most with Absynth is definitely this aetherizer right here. So I'm just going to even go on, and I'm just going to take the wet. I'm going to turn the dry all the way down. So all we're hearing is the affected sound, which is going into this aetherizer here. And let's go ahead and just start to throw some random in here. And then if I transpose this up, I can keep everything in the range. And what's really cool is that we can go and we can actually filter these. So this is like some kind of very complex grain delay. Well, I don't even know if you could really call it that. There's no way to describe this really, but I could go in here and I could take this filter quantize and choose something like minor seventh. Let's throw some random on. Oh, this is a bandpass right now, so that's cutting off. Let's go in here. Let's change this grain duration. Throw a little bit of randomization on that. And some of this is just experimenting. I have worked with this particular effect a lot. Just throw a little rotation on this. And now, what we could also do is go in and take some of these parameters and we could actually create envelopes for these specifically. So you could be moving this around and imagine just how powerful that would be with all the other stuff going on in your patch. This is just a single sine wave, but we could go in here and add on some kind of like a wave shaper beforehand. I don't know if I really want a wave shaper. Let's add this super comb. Something like that's really awesome. Some of this is just pure experimentation. I like that. So let's go down a few octaves. We could feasibly continue on like this forever. So I'm just going to show you a few more examples. Here we're looking at Spire. And Spire is kind of interesting because I think that the effects built into it actually do sound really good with the instrument. Like they really work quite well. And this instrument also gives us some interesting features down here at the bottom with an EQ, these additional warm, soft boost modes, some sort of multi-band compressor that's built in. And we're just going to kind of look at these. So here's a preset we have loaded up. And if we go in here and mute all of the effects to start, you can hear just how much they add. So no chorus has been applied. Why don't we throw some chorus on here? 5 different modes. So one thing that might be cool would be to have the LFO controlling feedback. So in this instrument, we are allowed to do that. I'm going to have to go here, choose the destination. I want to go into the chorus, and I'm going to choose chorus feedback. Set some depth. That's really cool, isn't it? Maybe also a little bit on this delay time here. You could also add in a little phaser. So you hear how we're now taking this sound and transforming it into this really nasty, grimy bass. And then this would definitely be a time to go in here, use a little bit of this X comp, and maybe now in the EQ, what we're going to do is choose boost. So as you just heard, there's a lot possible when you get in there and start manipulating with the effects, and it may take your mind and your ear in different directions. For example, as I started to mess around with the chorus and then put on an LFO on a couple of those parameters, I thought, hey, you know, this might work better as some kind of really grimy, distorted bass sound. And so that was the direction I took, and all of the moves I made were used to try to complement that and then get a sound that I'm, happy with at the end. We'll be spending a lot of time with FM8 next week, but I thought I'd just briefly show you the effects section of this instrument because it's kind of an integral part to the sound, especially that like dubstep growl sound that was really popular back in like 2011, 2012. And I remember hearing those sounds for the first time and thinking, wow, some people have really tapped into something with FM synthesis that is so far above and beyond my capabilities, until I realized that, yeah, they have done some pretty cool stuff with the FM section, but they've also spent quite a bit of time sculpting some of these built-in effects. And again, I have nothing wrong with that. I think that's totally cool. It's all about finding what works in these instruments. So you don't even have to technically use FM in here if you don't want to. I'm just going to set something up quickly. get some kind of a denser sort of tone here. Maybe use a different wave. Let's see. Let's try this one. No, it's not the one I like. This is the one I like. So I am applying a little bit of FM here. All right, so that's a little bit thicker. That will be useful for us to work with. Let's go over into the master section, which actually includes some effects. For example, we have this quality option here, and this is also where we get our unison detuning. So let's just go ahead and crank this up a little bit, add in some more voices. Throw a little detune. And now we have a pretty thick waveform with which to work with, and we can go into the effects section. And there even are some, presets that you can choose from. So I'm going to go for heavy crunch here. Just take a listen to what that sounds like. Get maybe more of a balance. We could obviously crank up the volume again, have to go back to the master. And you'll see with these effects that one thing we can't do is change the signal flow on them. So it kind of is what it is. And that's probably my one knock on this. And as we move forward with the last couple examples, we'll see how we do get the ability to change around the signal flow. But what really kind of made the growl sound possible was this talk wah here. And you could actually set this up with the mod wheel so that when you turn the mod wheel, you get kind of like this talking bass effect. Go somewhere here. So combined with some other effects and things, it can really take you very far. We could go and throw a reverb on here. There's this interesting like psych delay that's sometimes fun to work with. It's maybe more fun. Go down to the other extreme. Crank this up. So things like that, I think the effects are really a big part of what gives FM8 its character sound, and so they're not something to overlook or skip over when you're really trying to learn that particular synthesizer. With Massive, we get some features and functionality that we don't typically associate with the majority of subtractive synths on the market. For example, we have the routing possibilities, so we can drop these insert effects into a few different locations, something that we've already looked at and talked about before. But inside of here, we have things like bit crushers, frequency shifters, and also some distortion options, and as well as a hard clipper. So for example, here, let's go more towards a square wave. Maybe we'll go and we'll add a couple of voices, not too much. Something like that. We'll go into the filter a little bit just so we can, add these inserts and show you the difference pre and post. We'll just use a classic low pass here. So when we head back into the routing tab, we can see that, for example, here with the inserts, right now it's coming after the filter. So if we put a hard clipper in, it's going to make a big difference here as compared to sticking it in there before. So let's put it actually after. And what also we can do with these effects is we can modulate them. So that's not something that we normally are able to do, or at least we can't do easily. Sometimes we have to go to the modulation matrix, and not all the parameters are going to be selectable. But here I could take an LFO, for example, and I could put it on the drive, and we could just slow this right down. Get a little bit of movement here. Something like that is pretty cool. We could add a secondary insert if we wanted to, but I think you get the point there. Over to the effects, you'll see that we have some specialty things. For example, these distortions, the teletube and the Bronner tube, these are a couple of distortion effects that people often associate with Massive. They have a particular sound to them. So if we put on the Bronner tube here, hear the effect that's having. And then FX slot 2, we don't have access to those distortions, and that's because this is wired FX1 followed by FX2 followed by this final little EQ module on the end. So in here we might put on more of like a spatial effect. We could take something like the dimension expander, which is something that you've seen copied in instruments like Serum. Really, it's just a bunch of like choruses, a lot of small delays, but there's no like tail on the end of it like a reverb. So it can make your sound more stereo without potentially, clouding or muddying other parts. This would be a sound that might actually benefit from like some weird pitch movement on it. I think that would sound kind of cool. Let's try this. And then maybe we could consider probably put some movement on that filter. I don't know. I'm not going to go through this again. You guys get the gist at this point. Just showing you some of the effect possibilities here inside of an instrument like Massive. We could take one of these envelopes here and again modulate some sort of parameter on the effects unit itself. So that's kind of cool. You let the pitch motion do its thing, and then you drive in the distortion pretty hard. So I might even put this one on both of these parameters. So yeah, that's kind of a neat and cool sound that we made pretty much just using the effects. Last but certainly not least, we come to instruments like Serum and Diversion, where the sky is literally the limit in what you can do with the effects processing. I've spent a lot of time creating sounds thus far, so this time I'll just speak theoretically, because by now you have a good idea of how all of these instruments work. I can go into the effects section here, I can turn on these different effects, and I can even then go and take it further by changing the signal flow. So where I put the distortion is usually very important, pre or post filter. Where does this reverb occur? Is that occurring pre or post filter? Where do I put the EQ in relation to all the rest of these things? And then within each of these effects, we get a variety of controls and settings that can all be modulated using any of our modulators down here, whether that is a macro control, an envelope, an LFO, velocity, the key tracking, whatever the case may be. If there's a knob on it, we can modulate it, and that is what makes this a very powerful and flexible effects unit. So we're not just limited to one or two effects. We're not just limited to the signal flow that's provided for us. No, we can pick what we want to bring in and where we want to put it. What I just said about serum also holds true for diversion, and in some ways, diversion can even go deeper if you want it to, mainly because we have here things like multi-staged envelopes, whereas in serum, we only have the LFOs and your classic ADSRs. So in this instrument, when I go into the effects section, you can see that we actually have room for, I believe, this would be 4, 8, 12 effects. And we can even adjust this slider to determine where these effects are going to occur. So for example, it would be rare that you would be going so complicated where, for example, you're sending a part of oscillator 1 into bus 1, a part of oscillator 1 to bus 2. Maybe oscillator 3 is only going to bus 2 and oscillator 2 is only going to bus 1, and you're sending a small amount. So if you remember some of our earlier videos, that should all kind of make sense to you for the most part. Well, we could take that even further by putting some effects only onto bus 2 and some effects only to bus 1, and then setting those relative balances. You can get some really crazy interesting sounds by doing that, but it's going to be rare that that happens. So instead, if you want most of your effects to come and be applied to both buses, so post bus 1 and bus 2, you can actually take this little slider here and you can send it back so that you could have room for like 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7 effects. Not that you'd ever even need that many, but you can certainly do it. And so you can see when I right click, we have a lot of options here. We have reverb, delay, echoes, grain shifters, tremolo, a chorus, a flanger, a phaser, and we can use 2 of those if we wanted to, say, have one chorus have slightly different effects to a second chorus. You'll see that if I go up here and I select chorus 1 again, it's just going to move it over, but we could add in a secondary chorus if we needed to. Something like that with different settings. And then again, all of these parameters are completely modulatable. If I right click and choose a modulation source, it can be anything I want it to be from this drop down menu, including the multi-staged envelopes and including the morph feature that we have here in the master mix. So certainly something to experiment with. Of all of the instruments, I'd probably argue that diversion will go the deepest in terms of what you can do with modulation on effects. But of course, we still do have to use this mod matrix, which for some people is something they don't particularly enjoy doing. But for me, I don't really have a problem with it. It's pretty quick and easy to set up. If I send this into there, I can determine the depth and we get the little readout like so. So not a problem. And, even though effects processing is not really considered a part of the traditional subtractive signal flow, when you consider just how much most of these modern instruments, especially the software, relies on effects processing, you definitely want to check it out and you want to use it when it's appropriate.